this video, we are going to begin discussing some of the reactions to industrialization. We've looked at the Industrial Revolution and industrialization from a variety of perspectives, particularly economic and social, to a lesser extent cultural as well. So what we want to do now is to start looking at the reactions to industrialization, particularly in their influence on politics. So what we'll be doing today, or what we'll be doing in this video, is discussing the birth of socialism. And socialism is a collective term, a categorical term, given to a variety of political ideologies or political movements that responded or reacted to what they saw as the problems or pitfalls of capitalism and industrialization, industrial capitalism in particular. So the origins of socialism can be tied to the 19th century, to the mid-19th century, and to the changes brought by industrialization in terms of economy, society, and culture of these new industrial nations. As we've seen, the Industrial Revolution drove a tremendous amount of economic growth. It created a tremendous amount of wealth and opportunity, but it did not have those effects universally. It was not equally beneficial to everyone in society. So there were a number of critics of industrialization from across the industrial spectrum, from almost every industrial country that existed in world history. And they rejected many of the basic principles of laissez-faire capitalism. And laissez-faire just means, it's French basically for leave it, or let it do its thing, leave it alone. It's unrestricted capitalism. And they rejected the idea that laissez-faire capitalism and the tenets of liberalism, 19th century liberalism, could be in the best interest of everyone in society. They basically argued that guaranteed rights don't put food on the table, and a free economy, an unrestricted or kind of ungoverned economy, doesn't provide for everyone. There are going to be winners and losers in a laissez-faire approach to capitalism or laissez-faire approach to the economy. So these reformers, who have earned the title socialist collectively, these reformers wanted the government to step in, governments to step in and ensure that everyone was provided for. Everyone had enough to survive on. And they believed that society, in some way, shape, or form, could work collectively for the benefit of everyone. And that's basically the principle, or the two principles, that all categories of socialism have in common. Number one, they believed that unrestricted capitalism had led to problems. And two, they believed that there could be some model of cooperative society that would provide for everyone. So it would become, socialism overall would become a profoundly important ideology in the 19th and 20th centuries, perhaps one of the most significant ideologies that shaped the early 20th century. Actually the entire 20th century. And so it's important to understand where it came from. So today we're going to trace the origins of socialism as a political category or a political movement to understand how it fits into the framework of world history. So there are a variety of types of socialism, dozens of types of socialism in fact. Because, like I said, they're united in that critique of laissez-faire capitalism and a belief in cooperative economy. But they had varying levels of radicalism attached to them. So we're going to talk about a few, just so you can get a sense of the variety of socialisms that existed in 19th and 20th century industrial societies. So we'll start with what's called utopian socialism. And utopian socialism provided a far-reaching and original critique of social changes. They focused on the social changes driven by industrialization, and they didn't necessarily believe that those social changes had been good, that they'd been beneficial. So utopian socialists tended to focus on a heaven on earth, this idea that a cooperative society could create a heaven on earth. They rejected what they called egotistic individualism and promoted cooperation. They believed that it was possible to create a system in which wealth and goods were shared equally among citizens. So you have a variety of different approaches to that. One of the most famous was associated with a man named Robert Owen. Robert Owen was one of the utopian socialists who acted instead of really kind of just talking about it or philosophically developing a system. And Owen wanted to create the model of a factory town which put utopian socialist practices into existence. It put them actually into practice. So he was a Welshman who'd made quite a bit of money in the textile industry in the late 18th and early 19th century, but he had traveled in the factory's workrooms and was disgusted by the labor conditions that his workers were in. And so he believed there had to be a better way. So what he does is he founds this utopian socialist community called New Lanark. He founded it in Scotland, and he turns it into a model factory, what he calls a model factory. And in it, everyone shares in the means of production, so everyone owns the means of production, everyone shares in the labor, and everyone shares in the profit. He provided sturdy, clean housing, schools for children, a basic standard of living, and he believed that this system could work to the benefit of everyone. Everyone would share equally in the labor and share in the profits as well. And New Lanark was relatively successful. He did manage to prove that a society or a factory town organized in this model could work. So he picks up and tries it again in Indiana, in a factory town called New Harmony, but it wasn't quite as successful. The factory workers took advantage of this utopianism, took advantage of the relative equality, and so that tended to be, that was less successful than New Lanark had been. So, Robert Owen, who was probably the most successful of the utopian socialists, still had a bit of a mixed bag in terms of actually enacting practical reform. So the utopian socialists were important not necessarily because they were successful, but because they provided a compelling critique of capitalism and a compelling critique of industrial liberalism. Future socialists would build on their critique and establish further-reaching critiques and kind of political ideologies. You have, for example, the practical socialists. Practical socialists decided that they didn't want to create this utopian town. They wanted to focus on specific issues and address those issues by changing the laws. One of the key principles of the practical socialists was what historians call feminist socialism or socialist feminism, which was an argument that in order to get more rights and equality for the working class, you needed first to have more rights and equality for women. That the elevation of women and the elevation of the working class should go hand in hand. But what you probably most closely associate with socialism is the work of a man named Karl Marx. And specifically, Marx's work is called scientific socialism, because what Karl Marx and his partner Friedrich Engels attempted to do was to apply basic economic principles and rational thought, or what they consider to be rational thought, to the economy and to the social and political effects of the economy. They embraced the utopian socialist critique of society, but dismissed it as unscientific. So they had a better justification and a better answer to the problems or the questions raised by the utopian socialists. They claimed to have proof of how history worked and posited the cyclical nature of history that would inevitably result in the rise of the working class. They call it on a language of natural law, coming out of the scientific revolution and the Enlightenment, and on Darwin's theory of evolution, to say that the emergence of a socialist state, or the final stage of economic development, which Marx called communism, was being driven by these natural laws. So Marx and Engels are associated, or most closely associated, with two key works. One is Das Kapital, and Das Kapital is a critique, an economic critique of capitalism. So just like Adam Smith in The Wealth of Nations had critiqued mercantilism as an economic system, Marx and Engels criticized capitalism as an economic system, arguing that it was inherently exploitative and inconsistent with democratic values. In the democracies and republican forms of government as they existed in the 19th century, capitalism had created more or less what Marx saw as an oligarchy, in which the elite had all the power, even though they made up a minor percentage of the population, and the majority of the population, the working class, had very little power. He said a system like this is fundamentally undemocratic. So capitalism, because it elevates the few at the expense of the many, is incompatible with democracy. So he offers this critique and says, therefore, capitalism is just a stage in the world's economic development. So just like mercantilism was a stage, capitalism was a stage, and it was leading to a better stage, what he would call the communist stage. So in the Communist Manifesto, they argued, which was one of the most important political treatises in modern history, they laid out a few key principles. One was the idea of dialectical materialism. And this is really just a fancy way of saying that world history, that the history of industrial nations, actually the history of nations, was based on class struggle, a struggle between the haves and the have-nots. And wherever you find yourself in history, whether you're looking at pharaohs and slaves, lords and serfs, owners and factory workers, the struggle is basically the same. It's between the haves and the have-nots. Inevitably, in history, he says, you see the have-nots struggling with the haves and eventually overthrowing them. So you would have the middle class, or the bourgeoisie, as he called them, overthrowing the nobles in the French Revolution. The middle class, the bourgeoisie, then established themselves as the haves, the factory owners, and a new group of have-nots, which he called the proletariat, this industrial working class, emerged. So the new struggle was between the bourgeoisie and the proletariat. The second tenet of the Communist Manifesto was something called the labor theory of surplus value, which basically says that the value of an item rests in the labor that it took to produce it. Everything else was just the greedy bourgeoisie, the greedy middle class, trying to capitalize on the labor of their workers. And the final tenet of the Communist Manifesto was the inevitable collapse of capitalism. He said that history is cyclical, and it goes through this pattern of haves versus the have-nots, where eventually the have-nots rise up and overthrow the haves. What that means is that eventually the proletariat will rise up, the factory workers will rise up and overthrow the bourgeoisie, the factory owners, and establish this final, most perfect stage of economic development in which the majority have the economic, cultural, social, and political power. So that socialism, or communism as it was put into practice, as it would be put into practice, would replace capitalism at some point. And so what he argued for, what Marx and Engels argued for in the Communist Manifesto, was a furthering of this movement. They said the proletariat has to become aware of their status, they have to become aware of their class identity, they have to become aware that, of their historical role in society. And as they develop what they called class consciousness, as the proletariat developed class consciousness, they would inevitably result or end in this communist revolution. So these ideas of scientific socialism and the progress of history and an economic critique of capitalism would structure not only the late 19th century, but the 20th century as well. So it's profoundly important that we understand both the nature and critique of socialism so that we can compare it to the way that socialism and the ideals of communism were put into practice how they were adapted, how they were changed in the 20th century, and how they posed challenges to the existing world structure. Thank you.